live.
Good evening, everyone. I am told that we are live now. This is a Board of Directors special meeting held on the 23rd of June, and it's a Zoom virtual meeting. Want to welcome everyone to it and hope your 2 days of summer are going well so far. Anyway, this meeting is being recorded, live streamed on our YouTube channel. We have had some technical difficulties here with the internet connection at the beginning, so hopefully our wizard technician here, Zach, will be able to work us through and we won't have any glitches. But that may happen, as sometimes does. Are there any additional agenda items? None noted, Madam Clerk. Is there any declaration of conflict of interest with respect to the materials that were presented to you earlier? None, no hands up, Madam Clerk, so we'll move on. We have business arising from the previous minutes. Did we ever get previous minutes on the previous discussions? No, we don't have any. So we'll move on to the draft comments on Phase 1 regulatory proposals under the Conservation Authorities Act. And this has been in the works for the last couple of years. We've been attending meetings even before COVID with respect to these regulatory framework changes for conservation authorities. And there are some challenges that have been posed to the 36 conservation authorities across Ontario. And that's why we're having this meeting, so we can discuss this and send them forward to the new Minister of Environment and Campgrounds. This, of course, was the Bill 229. Okay, so what we're going to do is Judy is going to give some initial comments with respect to this process. And then Lori Minchell is back and she will provide a PowerPoint with respect to the challenges that we're facing, along with comments that will be hopefully suffice to go to the minister's office. So I'll pass it over to Judy now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So tonight, we're here to review the draft comments on the Phase 1 of the regulatory proposal under the Conservation Authority Act. You received from us a staff report with 2 attachments, being the draft comments in a letter form. The letter has been updated to reflect the recent cabinet shuffle, and it will be sent to the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks, the Honorable David Piccini. The letter will also be copied to the Minister of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry, who is now the Honorable Greg Rickford. Letter will also be copied to the clerks for the municipalities in the watershed. The second attachment is the regulatory proposal consultation guide, and this can also be found on the Environmental Registry of Ontario. This was provided for your information at the June 2nd board meeting also. So Lori has prepared a presentation, like Mike said, to take us through the analysis and comments that we're proposing to send prior to the deadline of June 27th. According to MECP website, and it was last updated May 13th, the Phase 2 of this, the regulatory proposal, will be released for consultation later this year and will focus on municipal levies related to the mandatory and non-mandatory programs and services, and also will address the standards for delivery of non-mandatory programs and services. Until we have the actual regulations in hand, it's really hard to assess the impact on us, but this is the approach they've taken. So we've gone through the guide, and I'll turn it over to Lori to take you through the comments we're proposing.
So how come I don't have that? Oh, how do I get that up on mine? I'll watch that.
It should be on.
Give me just a sec here while I share the screen.
You're on, Lori, and we can see you.
Okay.
Okay, as we go through these, because there are several different categories that are being addressed by Lori, if you have any burning questions at the time that the slide is up, that would probably be the best time to ask, because it is about a 20-minute presentation, I understand.
Okay. So, so we'll just skip over to slide 2 because Judy said everything for slide 1. Okay. So this is the phase 1 regulatory proposal, and the proposed regulations that are up for consultation are focused on the mandatory programs and services to be delivered by the conservation authorities, the proposed agreements with participating municipalities to fund non-mandatory programs and services through a municipal levy, the transition period to establish those agreements, the requirement to establish community advisory boards, and the Minister's Section 29 regulation consolidating the 36 individual Section 29 regulations relating to the operation and management of Conservation Authority-owned lands. The first part of the mandatory programs and services sets out the categories of mandatory programs and services which conservation authorities would be required to provide in their jurisdiction. So these include programs and services related to the risk of natural hazards, conservation and management of CA-owned lands, conservation authority duties, functions, and responsibilities as a source protection authority under the Clean Water Act, and other programs and services described by regulation. And these are proposed to be a core watershed-based resource management strategy and the provincial water quality and quantity monitoring programs they're proposing to add now, although they can add more programs and services to the list for another 2 years, I guess, actually, yeah. So the risk of natural hazards piece refers to those programs and services that help manage the risk posed by flooding and erosion, as well as low water response. The mandatory programs and services that they have listed as being related to the risk of natural hazards include the administration of the Section 28 permits, including enforcement, land use planning input on behalf of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry under the Planning Act. That's the delegated responsibility that we have historically had. Flood forecasting and warning, operation and maintenance of CA-owned water control structures, those that mitigate the risk from flooding or support low flow augmentation, ice management services, low water monitoring and communication, the collection and management of information, and they put a great long list of this in, but basically needed to identify, study, avoid, and mitigate natural hazards, and communications, public awareness, and education regarding the risk of natural hazards. So we have a few concerns with this list. LPRCA's input to municipal official plans with respect to natural hazards is listed as a mandatory program. However, the municipal plan review is not referenced on either the mandatory or non-mandatory program lists, even though the municipal planning applications will still be circulated to us for comment under the Planning Act. Secondly, wetlands are not mentioned at all. And an advisory service related to wetlands is needed in the municipal land use planning process ahead of LPRCA's permit process, because it's during the municipal land use planning process that the principle of development is established, not here. Thirdly, the review for stormwater management is explicitly listed as non-mandatory. But the evolution of stormwater management in Ontario began with the need to mitigate for flood and erosion impacts of urbanization. So in summary, land use planning input and review related to natural hazards, wetlands, and stormwater management should be specifically identified as part of the mandatory land use planning service. And you can see here that my blue print is the actual comment that's in the letter to the minister.
Yeah, I figured that.
Yeah.
That's
So,
very clear.
also, private land stewardship programs are proposed to be non-mandatory, and this is a concern. The focus of LPRCA's early mandate was on forest and wetland acquisition, reforestation, and aiding landowners to reforest marginal lands. It was hazard management through forest management. That's what LPRCA was. So private land stewardship programs such as tree planting and soil erosion control are an integral part of natural hazard mitigation and should be recognized in the mandatory programs and services related to the risk of natural hazards. Now, the Conservation Authorities Act also lists the conservation and management of CA-owned lands as a mandatory program. So this regulatory proposal provides details about the mandatory program as follows: administration of the Section 29 regulations for conservation areas, including fees, permits, and enforcement activities. An overarching strategy for CA-owned lands, including guiding principles, objectives, land securement and acquisition and disposition strategy, management principles for different land use categories, etc. Securement and acquisition and disposition policy, a management that meets the new regulatory requirements, because I know we have one, but they'll have regulatory requirements for it. A management plan for each CA-owned property or group of properties, and they are including the management and maintenance of CA-owned lands, including land management stewardship activities for protecting natural heritage systems, monitoring and enforcement actions to ensure the maintenance of property boundaries and land title from encroachment, and the identification and mapping and assessment to determine maintenance and repair needs. This regulatory proposal notes that other land uses on Conservation Authority owned lands, such as the provision of recreational opportunities or environmental education, are not mandatory programs and services. Now, LPRCA owns over 11,000 acres of land in 146 parcels in a range of categories, including revenue-generating campgrounds and managed forest tracts, non-revenue generating reservoir lands, hazard lands, wetlands, and natural heritage features. So this regulation should recognize the need for reasonable timelines for the completion of these management plans for CA-owned properties and the financial resources that will be required to complete these plans. Also, risk reduction related to the management and maintenance of CA-owned land should not be limited to illegal activities, but as described in the regulatory proposal now, but should also include activities to ensure public and CA staff safety on the property, since these are public properties. Also, I guess, and we're on to the next. Also listed as a mandatory program, the duties, functions, and responsibilities as a source protection authority remain the same as they have been. And the Conservation Authorities Act also provides for other programs and services prescribed in regulation, and there are 2 programs are proposed to be added at this time. The pictures don't show my check marks there. The requirement for a core watershed-based resource management strategy that would provide a long-term watershed-based perspective for the delivery of programs and services. This is where the word watershed comes back into the whole thing. And the long-standing provincial water quality and water quantity monitoring programs, we've been doing these for over 60 years, which are provincial CA monitoring partnerships that should continue on a watershed basis. Now, I have check marks on that slide. So there, oh, it comes up on that one. That's green. We're in support of these 2 additions. The second regulation deals with non-mandatory programs and services. The province has clarified that non-mandatory programs and services are simply those that are not prescribed in law or policy. It doesn't speak to the importance of them. The Conservation Authorities Act will now require municipal agreements or service contracts for the funding of non-mandatory programs and services. And there are 4 categories of programs and services: the mandatory ones that we've just been looking at, the non-mandatory programs that are not funded by Levy, the non-mandatory programs or services that are requested by a municipality, and non-mandatory programs and services that are advised by the Conservation Authority Board. And for these latter 2, a memorandum of agreement or a service contract will be required for the levy portion of the funding sources for those programs.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question?
Dave, go ahead.
Chairman, through you to Lori, this particular area about funding, it's almost a special levy then if it's a non-regulated program. And I'm thinking specifically of Bacchus here, the museum. So according to this legislation, if approved, it would be solely the special levy to the municipality who hosts the geography of the particular area. In this case, it would be Norfolk County. So we would not go to other municipal partners to be supporting the levy to continue with the programs at Bacchus. Am I wrong?
It's not specifying, Dave, that will be up to the municipalities in the watershed. If it is a non-mandatory program that's advised by the Conservation Authority Board, then we'll have to put it in our transition plan, how the board plans to move forward with it, with the various programs that will need these kinds of agreements and service contracts, and then discuss with the municipalities about the agreements. So that is to be discussed. The other part of it is that the phase 2 regulations, which we haven't even seen a proposal for yet, are going to talk about the levy. So there'll be more information there. And that's why we're kind of avoiding deciding what all the impacts are on this authority until we actually see those regulations.
Okay, very well. I was just concerned about the plural of municipality, whether all the municipalities could be involved in these special levies or not. And I think the answer is yes. So I think that's to be determined. It's some fine tuning, but we want to make sure that that we're all involved in this. But no, you've answered my question. Thanks, Lori.
Dave, I believe you were alluding to the Bacchus Heritage Village, right?
Mhm.
And I can tell you that the Premier Doug Ford made an announcement in the Toronto Star several that the Black Creek Pioneer in Toronto would not be closing, that it would still continue to be operating and funded. So the message was sent through Toby Barrett. He's aware of it already because they're kind of similar operations with Bacchus and the Black Creek, but of course Bacchus is much smaller. So hopefully that would keep things alive down there.
But it gives us an argument, Mr. Chairman. If they're going to keep something like that open, it gives us an argument too. So yeah, so there's a comfort level. I don't want to beat this up too much. I just wanted to know whether it's the entire Conservation Authority or just the County of Norfolk who would be involved in the special levy. That was simply my question.
I see Ian's hand. Go ahead, Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. My question is along a different line, and hopefully I'm not stealing thunder from another slide, but how many services would we, roughly, do you think would require a memorandum of understanding with neighboring municipalities? What is sort of that pie in our business? And it's assuming we're going to have a memorandum of understanding for all these different services, but how many, what does that really affect when we're looking at our business? Are we going to be required basically to go to the municipality for certain budgetary improvements, or can I have a little bit more of an explanation as to how that impacts the LPRCA and the watershed?
Okay, I will ask Lori to respond.
The ministry did clarify for us in one of the meetings that we were on,
Oh, thank you.
that if it's a watershed-wide program, it's non-mandatory. Non-mandatory just means the province hasn't put it in legislation that we are required to do it. So if there are non-mandatory programs that are watershed-wide, there only needs to be one agreement if every municipality is in. We don't have to have like lots of these for each municipality. So the ones that are talking about a service requested by a municipality would be where we provide a service for someone. And for example, we under service contract have been collecting the water samples above and below a couple of the Norfolk County wastewater treatment plants so that they can meet the compliance requirements with the ministry. That's something that was requested. That's under service agreement. So that's an example of that. I think it's really premature to talk about which programs might have to have these agreements, because until we see the regulation, especially with everybody making all these comments like we are making today, we don't really know what's mandatory and non-mandatory just yet. I think that LPRCA is probably in a really good position for low numbers for those agreements, just because we have historically stuck very close to the core mandate. So.
And I see Crystal has joined us and she has a hand up. Crystal?
Thanks. So sorry for being a few minutes late here. I actually participated in the the information session there that they had offered up. I don't know if anybody else had joined that or not. And that was one of the questions that I had asked. So, in terms of Bacchus, I think we need to fight on this pretty hard. To me, the idea that the taxpayers, of our municipalities need to fund this, when I don't know, I would be curious to send something back, including, numbers of visitors that aren't local. So we you've seen, rulings in a sense where it's considered discriminatory in some cases to charge, somebody from outside your municipality a different rate than a local. But at the end of the day, what this is driving to is exactly that. Why should somebody that is in an urban center, that has a far stronger tax base than we do, that doesn't have a conservation authority associated with it, yet we're bearing the brunt basically for everybody from the province, using these facilities, or in the case of Bacchus, that would be expected to maintain on our own. So, they said to me in the information session, they said, well, we never looked at it that way before. So I think that, to me, there should be, a really strong push on this. And again, looking at it from the perspective, what are our numbers that are coming from outside our municipalities and visiting these sites?
Well, our numbers won't have been looking very good for the last year or so, that's for sure. But I'm sure we have numbers from previous years.
Historically, we'll use it, I'm sure, school kids and so on, but there has to be a lot of people that travel from, and look at it even in the context of just Norfolk, then, that travel from outside Norfolk County to go to Bacchus. But we're going to have to fund that now. If that's, it's no different than really what's going on with the beach. It's taxpayers from across the province that come to use that asset.
Thank you. Anybody else with a question at this time? No? Okay, we'll move on, Lori.
Okay, we're on the next slide. Yep. So the proposed regulation also requires us to develop a transition plan that includes a work plan and timeline to develop agreements with the municipalities, inventory of programs and services indicating which category and how they will be funded, a consultation process with the participating municipalities on that inventory of programs and services and how they've been categorized. A list of any new mandatory programs the authority will need to provide, a list of non-mandatory programs and services that we're going to seek agreements with, and a list that don't require municipal agreements because they're funded by they're funded by revenue that's not from a municipal levy. This transition plan here is to be completed by the end of 2021. And then quarterly progress reports on implementation are to be submitted to the ministry through 2022. The implementation is to be completed by the end of 2022 and reflected in the Conservation Authority's 2023 budget. The ministry is also proposing to authorize extensions if they're requested by the authority and at least one municipality, at least 90 days before the end of the transition period. So by the end of September, we'd have to know whether we were going to be able to make that date or not. The proposed overall transition period to January 23 requires all agreements for the use of municipal levy to be in place, and a new financial structure would be in place for the 2023 fiscal year, which would be required for budget preparation in the fall of 2022. So the development of the required transition plan by the end of this year requires that the regulations be available and enacted promptly, including the phase 2 regulations on the levy apportionment that have not yet been released. The proposed timeframes for the transition period will be challenging, even if the final regulations for phase 1 are available by the end of August. Phase 2 is unknown, and without both completed, this timeline that they're putting in regulation is at risk. That's our comment on that. It's getting late to get her done. The third set of regulations in this proposal, the government is proposing to require the Conservation Authority to establish one or more community advisory boards to, at a minimum, provide advice and recommendations to the authority on the authority's strategic priorities and its associated policies, programs, and services, to discuss opportunities to coordinate with other environmental initiatives, for example, with municipal initiatives, to identify opportunities for community engagement, and to suggest potential community outreach opportunities. The government is proposing to prescribe an enabling framework for the community advisory boards, but leave the details around composition, activities, functions, duties, and procedures to a terms of reference document to be developed by the Conservation Authority. So I'm not going to go through that, just to show you, though, that they're going to tell us lots of things to do with it. We're concerned that an ongoing community advisory board could be an unnecessary and costly duplication of the general membership's role. The administrative support for an effective community advisory committee is staff intensive and can be comparable to that required for this general membership. To be able to effectively deliver on a sound public engagement strategy through the Public Advisory Committee, LPRCA would like the province to consider addressing the additional resources required to support the governance and administration of them. Our comment. And lastly, the province is proposing to replace the 36 Conservation Authority specific Section 29 regulations for conservation areas with our properties with one minister's regulation. The current Section 29 regulations manage activities on all the CA owned lands, including the use of public lands and services available, the prohibition of certain activities, setting fees for access and use, including recreational facilities. It basically enables us to charge fees. I think that's what that is. Administering permits for certain land uses, and protection against property damage and for public safety. And right now, this minister's regulation is expected to be broadly consistent with the policy principles and provincial content that's been used in the past to establish the individual conservation authorities' regulations. However, LPRCA does not agree that the consolidation of the individual CA Section 29 regulations into one minister's regulation is beneficial if it leads to a mandatory universal standard for all conservation authorities. The conservation authorities differ significantly in the implementation of their enforcement programs and have a wide range of abilities to support future additions to the Section 29 regulations that are needed by some of the conservation authorities. So having one regulation that applies to all conservation authorities may, in the future, either push the staffing, equipment, and skill requirements well beyond what many CAs can financially support. For example, if we were to move in the direction of the Ontario Parks. Or, on the other hand, limit the tools and authorities that some conservation authorities need and could support. Whereas an individual approach would allow each CA to meet its enforcement needs without creating a standard that some CAs would not be able to achieve. Overall, these proposed Phase 1 regulations would require LPRCA to develop several new policies, plans, committees, and consultation processes. An inventory of programs and services by the end of this year, a transition plan submitted by the end of this year, quarterly reports to the Ministry on implementation through 2022, agreements with each municipality for non-mandatory programs and services that require municipal levy by the end of 22, asset management and operating plans for the water control structures, a core watershed-based resource management strategy, an overarching strategy for CA-owned lands with public participation in the planning process, a land securement, acquisition, and disposition policy for CA-owned lands that meets the new regulatory requirements, a management plan for each property or group of properties, and the formation and operation of a community advisory board to provide advice and recommendations to the authority on our strategic priorities and associated policies, programs, and services. Now, if all of these things are best practice and given enough time, the Conservation Authority could achieve these things. Our concern is that timelines might be set in regulation for the delivery of all of these new initiatives. And caution is advised here that timelines could require capacity that LPRCA does not currently have, and thereby require additional municipal levy funding to meet the regulatory requirement. So these comments have been consolidated into the letter to the minister that is attached to the staff report. And this letter, as amended at your direction, will be the submission to the environmental registry in response to the posting. The next steps, the staff will submit your comments through the environmental registry at your direction and before the June 27th deadline. And then we wait to see the Phase 1 regulations that will be enacted at some point this summer. And then the preparation of the transition plan begins, but it's really reliant on the final Phase 1 and Phase 2 regulations, because the Phase 2 regulations are proposed to address the municipal levy apportionment and the standards and requirements for the delivery of non-mandatory programs and services and we haven't seen the proposal on the phase 2 regulations yet. So we will send in our comments on this particular posting, and then I guess we wait. So, Mr. Chairman, that's the end of my presentation.
And thank you, Laurie. You've done a great job in addressing some of those challenges. And first of all, I guess, has that slide deck that you just presented, has it been sent out to board members?
Not the slide deck.
Okay, it would help. It gives a kind of a caption, a summary of what we're discussing in this major document. And if you could send it out to the board members, that'd be great.
Yep.
And any further questions with respect to the presentation? Yes, John.
Right, as you're going through your presentation, it becomes very, very clear to me that they want all these initiatives from the government side. The initiatives are not complete because you're talking about phase 1, phase 2. Phase 2 is not complete, so we don't know where we're at. And it's a downloading of extra expense to us as a CA, which there is no discussion whatsoever where this money's going to come from. So it's almost like, you know what, load up your municipal partners by levy. Where else would the money come from? Because we have no income other than what we have today.
Right.
So I'm talking about, right? So it puzzles me that they're haphazard in their approach and yet spell out all these requirements without any solutions. We have to provide the solutions, which you did. And I appreciate that.
Comment that I would make is that in listening to what the government has been trying to do here is focus the Conservation Authority on the core mandates.
Right.
I think what they think is going to happen is that a lot of the stuff that they don't think Conservation Authority should be doing will fall off the plate and make room for some of this stuff. The trouble here is that this Conservation Authority has historically stuck so close to the core mandate that there really is very little opportunity for that here. And that's why you see what you see.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Ian, I saw your hand up. Ian Rabbits.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. My question is asking for some comparators. What are our neighboring watersheds? How are they reacting? I imagine they're saying many of the same things, but I would like to know the same chords that we're striking in response to Bill 229, and more specifically, those that affect our finances and our ability to operate, to be sustainable. And a second question, is there any opportunity to perhaps have a regional response and have maybe even a meeting with us in another watershed? A meeting much like tonight where we get together and we have the facts of the matter and understand Bill 229 as it is presented to us currently. And perhaps our voices would speak louder if there was a regional response or two or more conservation authorities getting together to react to Bill 229.
Ian, I think that question has been dealt with in the past 2 years, so I'm going to pass it over to either Judy or Laurie to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Conservation Ontario has put together comments that were brought forward to the council meeting on Monday. So as a collective, we did have an opportunity to comment on what they were proposing to send, and Mike attended the meeting. So their comments are similar to ours. We We did actually see where they did take some of our comments and incorporate it into the information that is going from Conservation Ontario. The one area where they didn't take such a strong approach as leaving section 29 more on an individual basis, but they are proposing that there is to form a working group where they feel they might be able to influence section 29 regulations, because like Lori said, one size doesn't fit all. To have arrestability, you need holding cars, you need places to put these people that you arrest. We don't want to go to that extent for enforcement. Right now, we rely on the OPP if we have something that we can't handle. We do kick people out under the Trespass Act from their campsites, but there's some of the city CAs that really want to take that enforcement to the next level. So that's probably one area where, being more rural, we need different rules, but I think we can work through a working group on that through Conservation Ontario. I have just sat in with, we just had one meeting with, we're calling it the Southwest Ontario GMs, just talking about it, making sure we all are on the same page, because we do have a lot of this, some of us have crossover municipality, so members, from different municipalities are on different CAs. So we wanted to talk as a group and share ideas. So far, Ian, from my perspective, the CAs that I'm talking to, we are very similar in our comments. So,
Okay,
And we have to submit this by the 27th, which is this coming Sunday.
right,
Yeah.
Monday's the deadline date.
Yeah.
Moving over to Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to, I guess the rest of the board in general. In my short time on the board, I do agree that it seems like this Conservation Authority in particular has been extremely well run, has stuck to the core mandates. And I really get the feeling that the province is moving in a direction to try and restrain conservation authorities that are seen to be overstepping their authority. That doesn't seem to be a problem here, but it may be in other jurisdictions. I'm not sure. My question is around the community advisory boards. When I read through the report, that one jumped out at me as being, I guess, unnecessary duplication, as is stated in the report. But the report left me with the feeling that we're simply asking for more funding in order to implement this board. And I'm wondering if we cannot maybe take a much more I'm not sure what word I'm looking for, a much more firm approach in saying that these boards are unnecessary, at least as it refers to LPRCA, and would result in additional costs, rather than just asking for more funding, but to really stress the needlessness of such a board.
Peter, in the meeting that I attended several months ago with respect to these changes, that was discussed and raised by several conservation authorities. And it was one of the items that the minister's staff kind of held pretty firm on with respect to these community advisory boards. But there is a lot of pushback on that one for sure, because they could be looked at upon as duplicating the work of the board members themselves. And also sometimes you can get on those boards an environmentalist or someone of that nature that could keep throwing curbs into the policies and programs of the Conservation Authority. If you had for example, somebody really tough and doesn't want to cut any trees or something like that. So you'd have to really be careful who is going to be sitting on these community advisory boards. So I'll let Lori, do you have anything to add?
Well, I actually think if they're going to require this, kind of even after everybody's commented about that, if they're going to require them, that what we need them to do is have the flexibility to apply them when they can be effective. Like, for example, you could have a watershed-wide community advisory committee if you were updating your strategic plan, for example, something like that. They're still costly and staff intensive, but at least they'd be focused on one thing for a defined period of time, and not trying to put advice into the authority's everyday business kind of thing. So if we had to have one, I'm hoping they'll put enough flexibility in to allow it to be focused strategic topic wise, and not looking at the day-to-day operation all the time.
Okay, Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with the comments that it would in effect become a pseudo board and could be very dangerous and difficult to work with. So I like the idea of a specific project or a specific timeline if we do have to have it.
And any further questions?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Sticking with the community advisory boards, I'm just wondering if this could be more silo-based as opposed to in general. And what I'm getting at, again, I keep bringing up the Bacchus Museum, that is an advisory board. What about the Lee Brown? That's an advisory board. There are other areas that we could form advisory boards in specific areas that would report to the general board of directors for LPRCA. And that might satisfy the needs of the amended policy here, rather than to just have a general community group that that looks at all aspects of it as the board does. So I just am I wrong? Is that something we're already doing it? We already have community advisory boards. It's just not a general community advisory board.
Right. Any comments?
Good point.
Yeah.
Well, the way it's currently written, it's not appointed a board. It would, do you have the specific wording, Lori?
Yeah, I'm looking for the slide number here for
It is
number 15.
strategic. It's really an overarching, looking at the strategic direction of the conservation authorities. I can't remember the exact wording, but.
Oh, it's the slide before that, 14.
Slide 14.
Yeah, that has the.
There it is, right there.
Provided
You were
advice
just
and
one by it.
recommendations.
So could you just read that out, Lori?
Yeah, so provide advice and recommendations on the authority's strategic priorities and associated policies, programs, and services.
So it's for the general board then, it's not just for the for specific areas. Okay.
Although
I'm incorrect. I interpreted that wrong, but no, thank you. That's good.
Okay. We also had another one a few years ago, the Low Water Response Advisory Board. We still have
a
that?
committee, yes.
yes,
Okay, so there's still that committee. So we have had these kind of ad hoc committees, advisory boards, I guess, in the past. And they've worked quite well, but it just depends if we can get a better definition of what they're looking for with
Can you bring
respect
up
to that
the comment related to
strategic
this one?
priorities and associated policies. What's that, Judy?
I just asked him. So, Mr. Chair, if we can just get some feedback from the board members, if they would like to change the comment in blue.
Can everybody see the comment in blue on the screen? Okay, I see heads saying yes.
So we heard from Peter that possibly if it's focused on specific items, do you want us to change it to be a little more direct that that we don't support it, or the board doesn't support it? We could put.
How does everybody feel? Is there a lot of concern with respect to support for this community advisory board, or would you like us to go with Peter's thinking that it's kind of overburdensome?
So that's currently the comment that we would be sending, but if we want to strengthen it anyway.
Go ahead, Ian.
Thank you, and through you to Peter's point, perhaps it doesn't address the fact that we may have to hire additional staff, that we may have to have an added administrative burden with having a staff member present for minutes taking. And, I think it doesn't directly address the fiduciary responsibility of the LPRCA, and that this is an added layer of administrative costs to us. It alludes to resources, but I think that is at the root cause. I respect that we have our concerns about who may comprise that board and what the standards are for appointment and who is making that appointment. Is it to the municipality? Is it the LPRCA? I'm still a little fuzzy on that detail. But I think it doesn't address directly the costs associated with having another board to manage in an advisory capacity.
So you think, with respect to what's in blue there, you think there should be something addressing the cost? Lori, did you just have a comment?
So
No.
we'll add something in with additional administration and costs.
Do you have the original one?
Well, it'll require additional human resources and cost, right?
Both.
We could say something like that unless it can be focused on one strategic topic,
Or area.
But it's still
that it is a costly duplication of the role of the board.
Right. That
Which I
sounds
think is
I think that's what we all want to say.
Yeah, that's
Is there any objection to that? Did everybody hear what Lori said? I take it they did.
Okay, we'll strengthen the wording there a bit then.
Okay, Jenny says that we're going to strengthen the wording. Does anybody have a problem with that? Don't see any hands up, an objection. Okay, let's move on.
Could you strengthen, sorry, Mr. Chair, I just couldn't figure out how to put my hand up. Could you strengthen it even more by saying, you know, it's a costly duplication of the board when, you know, those resources, those financial resources could be better directed to programs, or maybe not better directed, but the resources that it's take on this, you know, duplication of the board could be better, you know, used to support programs that are enjoyed by, or to support, you know, back, as you could even get more specific, you know, that are enjoyed by many. Something to that effect.
I know, like I said before, in the meeting that I attended, several conservation authorities that were in the virtual stream there did express the similar concerns as what we're discussing right today.
Yeah, I just think you need to be even more blunt, because it's completely contrary to the platform of, you know, the Ford government, you know, to reduce red tape, it's by doing this, you're cutting funding to programs that you actually need to provide duplication. And, you know, as going through COVID and you know, things like the migrant worker program, I mean, that's where I would go even further to say this is where governments need to look at eliminating duplication, given what we've seen in the current environment, not you know, adding additional layers that we simply don't need.
Moving over to,
Adding additional layers of bureaucracy, because that's all it is.
for sure. Moving over to Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if I could just suggest a little bit of wording for this, saying that we firmly oppose the imposition of the Community Advisory Board to the board as an unnecessary and costly duplication of the board, and that we encourage the provincial government to instead allow authorities to direct the funds which would have to go to those advisory boards into necessary programming.
Sounds good to me. Is there any further discussion with respect to that? I don't see any hands up. So that will be firmed up that way. Madam Clerk, did you get that? Will you be able to?
I'll get it later. yeah.
Okay, she is recording this meeting, so we will get that, the wording there.
Possibly, Mike, we could add on to the end of that, sort of going on the thought that Crystal had there, that this is in line with the government's initiatives to eliminate duplication.
Sure, we can actually
Yeah.
add that line also. Okay. Is there any more discussion with respect to these community advisory boards? Don't see any, so we will move on. Next, Lori, what do we got? You're done?
That's it. That's
Okay.
all we have for tonight.
That's all we've got for tonight. Does
Just like,
anybody else have any other questions with respect to the business that's listed in the agenda? No?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to let the board know.
We'll read it. That the LPRCA Board of Directors receives the report on the draft comments on the Phase 1 regulatory proposal under the Conservation Authorities Act as information, and that the LPRCA Board of Directors directs staff to submit the attached response letter for the Phase 1 regulatory proposal to the Ontario Environmental Registry, and that the LPRCA response letter for the Phase 1 regulatory proposal be circulated to the authority's member municipalities.
Mr. Chair, you maybe should add in there as amended.
Where do you want the as amended?
Submit the letter as amended,
Okay,
because we are changing that one comment.
good. Okay, and moved by Ian Rabbits and seconded by Valerie. Those in favor? That is carried. Thank you very much. And have a good night, folks. Thank you for sharing your Wednesday evening with us.